third in the series of critical histories of 20th century philosophy, moving across the analytic, continental, and pragmatist divides. This one appeared in Aeon, edited by Sam Dresser. When was it? They don't see the date. Aeon? A month or two ago. And this one is about, I think, in some ways, the most salient fact about Western philosophy as a whole in the 20th century. It was language obsessed. You know, I mean, people got to the point where, like, there are no questions in philosophy that are not questions about language. Or if there are, they're meaningless and stuff like that. And I guess I would say my experience along these lines is pretty dramatic, in that I was trained by Wittgensteinians, such as Core Diamond, and by Richard Rorty. These are language mongers to the max, all right? Rorty, I don't want to like ridicule my mentor or whatever, but I do think he wanted to replace the world with words, or he thought it already had been. It's really puzzling to me in a way, like how it got to this where there is only one thing, language. I do think that it had to do with professional conditions within the academy, among other things. I also do remember I think this might have been where I finally alienated Richard Rorty permanently. I think it was at a conference after my PhD, which he supervised, and I think I was reading, was he in the audience? Anyway, or conversation, and what I said was like, the 20th century was a century obsessed with language, and if the 21st century is also a century obsessed with language, I'm going to catch up on some much needed shut-eye. Well, I was kind of pissed about it, really. I mean, but anyway, but here, like, I guess my point is not to be polemic, to do a polemic against it, but to try to describe the history as it unfolded. There's nothing outside the text, wrote Jacques Derrida in 1967, his most famous line. Like most everything Derrida said, this notorious declaration becomes more difficult to interpret as one examines its context and the context of that context. Like, you might think you know what it means when Derrida says there's nothing outside the text. No. But anyway, there's nothing outside the text aptly captures the flavor of academic philosophy at the time it appeared, which was also the year that Richard Rorty published his anthology, The Linguistic Turn, 1967. That book embodied an argument that the most important philosophy of the 20th century was linguistic philosophy. And by then, in the 60s, everyone but a few reactionaries would have agreed with that assessment, that the most important philosophy being done now is linguistic philosophy. Philosophy had for decades been relentlessly emphasizing the nature of language, as opposed, for example, to the nature of reality, goodness, truth, or beauty. There was some dispute about whether there could be any genuine philosophical questions that were not questions about language. Looking back on it from here, the convergence on questions of language, indeed the relentless, almost exclusive focus on it as central to our experience, by thinkers otherwise so different that they could not or did not care to enter into any dialogue at all, that coincidence seems remarkable. It's one of the signal aspects of 20th century intellectual history, and a useful lens through which to view the development of philosophy during that time. In the 20th century, philosophy split into two discourses, each with its own canon and jargon, usually referred to as Continental and Analytic. Mastering them simultaneously, getting a solid handle on both Heidegger and Russell, for instance, or both Quine and Foucault, would have been a very intimidating prospect, and few had the motivation. Almost certainly, if one was housed, as a professor or grad student, one was housed in a department that did only one or the other, Continental or Analytic. Analysts held that continental philosophy was not philosophy at all, but meaningless yet relativistic babble, something of substantially less than no value. Continentalists characterized analytic philosophy as useless, punctilious logic chopping and scientism for its own sake, with no possibility of cultural critique or even meaningful connection to human life as it is actually conducted. They both kind of had a point about the other, but anyway, it's not surprising, however, that the lines of discourse had more in common than the participants in the ridicule thought they did. Analytic and continental philosophy emerged at the same time in the Western Academy out of a shared intellectual history, the rationalists, empiricists, idealists, and so on. The rivalry was as professional as it was conceptual, and the contest was always to see which side could get rid of the other's professors. Hopefully before they got to the professor stage, which side could get rid of the other's grad students. But in 1,000 ways, through the whole century, they were embedded in the same zeitgeist. They had a lot of the same obsessions, as well as a lot of the same drawbacks, even if, by 1967, they also had entirely different vocabularies. Analytic and continental philosophy were obsessed with language, almost entirely absorbed by it by century's end. And the motivation on both sides was similar. Linguistic philosophy was going to cure the discipline of the woolly, possibly empty, merely speculative metaphysics of the 19th century, the grand systems of people like Hegel, Schelling, or Schopenhauer. Turning from the direction of all history, or the nature of being itself, 20th century philosophers tended to focus on the meaning of phrases, if any, of phrases like the nature of all being itself. When they did, many concluded that such phrases were without significance or were being terribly misused, and the philosophy would be better off trying to clarify the nature of language, which seemed quite a bit more likely to pay off than the nature of being itself. The linguistic turn was a response to a professional and intellectual crisis that persisted from around 1890 to 1910. Elaborations of Hegelian and Kantian idealism had dominated the field for the better part of a century by then, and the systems seemed to be getting ever more elaborate, incomprehensible, and inapplicable in any other discipline, particularly in the sciences. 4. In comparison with the notably rapid developments in several empirical sciences of the era, philosophy seemed to be, physics for instance, in the early 20th century. On the other hand, psychology and anthropology, what were they doing? What were those sciences doing, those sciences? Philosophy seemed to be stuck elaborating old ideas of dubious relevance or even comprehensibility. I mean, the turn of the 20th century was the golden era of scientism, man, and Hegelianism was just not going to fly no matter what Hegel thought, which is that his philosophy was science. Take the analytic side first. Its basic thrust, as articulated by Russell and G.E. Moore early in the century, was to address and eliminate philosophical problems by analyzing the language in which they were couched, a strategy that both men felt was crystallized in their student/colleague Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus of 1921. The project of that fundamental turning point was to clarify the limits of meaningful language. Moore, for one, didn't try to explain the meaning of existence, but the meaning of the word exists, which he held was not a genuine predicate. He didn't try to tell us what particular things there were, but what particular meant, with extreme punctilious care. The conversation moved from the nature of the self to the meaning of I. Just as Russell and Moore hoped, this emphasis and accompanying advancements in logic, Russell and Frege in particular, revitalized the discipline to a significant extent and enhanced its academic respectability, setting off a discourse and a style of thinking and writing that dominated universities in the UK and the US for most of the century. I had an early paper on this that I originally wrote for a seminar with Stanley Fish at Hopkins, arguing that the analytic turn, the linguistic turn, or the analytic philosophy or the introduction of analytic philosophy was a response to a professional crisis that I've just described, I guess, And while it may, I try to document that carefully with sort of meta-philosophical writings of the period. While it may at times have descended into useless technicality, the reconstituted discipline, analytic philosophy, succeeded in defining an expertise and constraining thinkers methodologically from sheer flights of fancy, to some extent, at least. All genuine problems are at least theoretically capable of being solved, said the positivist philosopher A.J. Ayer in 1936. But most philosophical problems, he thought, were pseudo-problems, to be dissolved by close examination of the language in which they were couched. Such a metaphysical pseudo-proposition as, quote, the absolute enters into but is in self incapable of evolution and progress, he thought, Ayer thought, had no literal significance, even for the person who uttered it. The absolute enters into but is itself incapable of evolution and progress. Yes, I am sympathetic with the view that that is a meaningless sentence. But I think probably the source of the meaninglessness is the apparent referring phrase, the absolute with a capital A. See why we had to get rid of Hegelian philosophy? They thought they had a notion of what that was. Like that was just a common technical term that everyone threw around all day. Okay, so but that a sentence like that has no meaning because you can't even say what it would be, what empirical evidence could possibly bear on its truth or falsity, for example. Ayer said he plugged that sentence about the absolute randomly from the writings of one of the most typical and dominant late 19th century British philosophers, F.H. Bradley, who was echoing Hegel, obviously. He was asserting that almost all previous philosophy was literally nonsense, like all mimsy were the borogoves, but less amusing. And Ayer was saying that if philosophy was to have any respectable, I think that's key, respectable, useful, or well-defined subject matter, it would be found in the nature and function of language, not in the nature and function of reality. Esse es percipi. How's my Latin pronounced? Percipi? Wrote the empiricist metaphysician George Berkeley around 1710. To be is to be perceived. For something to exist or be real for Berkeley and for many others, Immanuel Kant, for example, was for it to play certain roles, for something to exist, was for it to play certain roles in human perception or to correspond to our mental imagery. That's what it is for something to exist. In a tribute to that style of metaphysics and a parody of it, in 1939, Quine said that to be is to be the value of a variable. Now, Quine took himself to be ridiculing the grand pronouncements of metaphysics, like to be is to be perceived, but it was hard not to hear that bound variable stuff as itself an ontological theory according to which existence is dependent on language. To be was to be picked out by the word something in sentences like there is something that is tall and green. Or in the language of logic, there exists an x such that fx and gx, in which the existential quantifier binds the variable x. Nelson Goodman, a colleague of Quine's at Harvard, summarized the approach in his book Ways of World Making, 1978. If I ask about the world, you can offer to tell me how it is under one or more frames of reference. But if I insist that you tell me how it is apart from all frames, what can you say? We are confined to describing whatever is described. We are confined to describing whatever is described. Our universe, so to speak, consists in these ways rather than of a world. Our universe consists of ways of describing rather than a world. Ways of describing, but not evidently ways of describing anything. Countless philosophical problems, Goodman and others argued. This is linguistic idealism. That's the way I think about this. And I think about Rorty like this. I think about Gadamer like this. There's nothing but words. You know, and that either makes me want to laugh or cry. And it definitely makes me want to confront, because I don't believe that anybody does believe that, including Richard Rorty. That's how we got into trouble. Countless philosophical problems, Goodman and others argued, had been manufactured by the alleged distinction between the world and our ways of describing it. We could make do with the latter, they thought, just the descriptions. Or really we had no choice until we could leave our own minds, which consists of that kind of stuff, linguistic representations. Rorty summarized the developments by the early 1970s as the world well lost. Now we could talk about words instead. As analysis developed, so did the motivation for it. In the later Wittgenstein, for example, the centrality of language to human experience and culture becomes an explicit theme, and the project of shedding light on it gains a more intrinsic motivation. It's no longer primarily a matter of destroying 19th century philosophy, but of showing the bases of human culture and experience and communication. That's worth elucidating for sure. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be thinking about language. I am indicating that maybe we can think through language about some other things. You may well deny that, I guess. To imagine a language means to imagine a form of life, Wittgenstein declared in Philosophical Investigations at mid-century. And to analyze a language is to analyze a form of life, a personality and a culture. By the time Rorty's The Linguistic Turn was published, assembling the first potent narrative of this intellectual history, it was obvious to everyone, whether they liked it or not, that the nature of language and the detailed analysis of its functioning, as in the ordinary language philosophy of J.L. Austin and others, or the linguistic metaphysics of Saul Kripke or David Lewis, was the central arena of 20th century philosophy. In his introduction to The Linguistic Turn, Rorty wrote, "The purpose of the present volume is to provide materials for reflection on the most recent philosophical revolution, that of linguistic philosophy. I shall mean by linguistic philosophy the view that philosophical problems are problems which may be solved or dissolved either by reforming language or by understanding more about the language we presently use. This view is considered by many of its proponents to be the most important philosophical discovery of our time, and indeed of the ages." So the linguistic turn, according to Rorty right at that moment anyway, was the most important philosophical discovery of the ages. As developed in the work of Donald Davidson and Rorty himself, for example, ideas like Quine's and Wittgenstein's moved toward what came to be thought of as postmodernism, which had been developing for some time in Europe. It conceived our experience, so this is interesting. If analytic philosophy is moving towards something that is, similar in various ways to postmodernism, first of all, it did that accidentally in a way, but it's an interesting convergence yet again. It conceived our experience and our world as linguistically constructed. That was happening on both sides of the ditch, I'm saying. Linguistic constructionism in some form. Admittedly, many figures would resist that formulation or any of these labels, but as shown specifically by Rorty, Richard Bernstein, and Charles Taylor, for example, the analytic and continental traditions, with previously little mutual awareness, by 1985 began to coincide in some of their conclusions, and those figures pointed that out. And they all knew each other too, I think. I don't know about Rorty and Taylor. I'm sure they did know each other. Rorty and Bernstein were like this. And I think Bernstein and Taylor, I don't know. Anyway, they all had some very similar consciousness and emphasis on language. Let's turn now to the continental side. Though he also bristled with hostility toward metaphysics, Heidegger held that it is in language that things first come to be and are. Heidegger said this, okay? I think it's intermittent in Heidegger, this thought, but that's a pretty strong formulation, isn't it? It is in language that things first come to be and are. Okay, so language is functioning there like nature in Lucretius or God in St. Thomas or something like that, right? And Heidegger defines the nature of the human like this: man shows himself as the entity which talks. Definitely man, right? The mansplanation is the essence of what it is to be human. The creature that talks. Man is the creature that... this does not signify that the possibility of vocal utterance is peculiar to him. I guess other species could utter. But rather that he is the entity which is such as to discover the world and himself. So something fundamental about consciousness. Contact with the world, our contact with the world is fundamentally linguistic, is the way I would read that. That's certainly the way that Rorty read this. In a way, I'm debriefing Rorty's classes from the 80s. So, to say that we're linguistic is to say that we are an entity which is such as to discover the world and ourselves. Now, that's not the sort of thing that Quine would say, and it's not the sort of sentence that Ayer would regard as meaningful, but it centralizes language as relentlessly as they do. And as much as theirs did, Heidegger's approach to philosophy of language set off decades of discourse. Heidegger developed these thoughts elaborately in later writings, such as On the Way to Language of 1959. One interpretation of them makes language the fundamental bottom line of human experience and reality. This was probably expressed most clearly in the hermeneutical philosophy of Heidegger's student and Rorty's hero, Hans-Georg Gadamer. The word hermeneutics originally referred to the discipline of textual interpretation, especially of the Bible, and by the late 20th century, Continental philosophy kept hinting that hermeneutics should be philosophers' successor discipline. Language is the fundamental mode of operation of our being in the world and the all-embracing form of the constitution of the world, wrote Gadamer in 1976. I'm still trying to figure out how this stuff went down quite so easily. In all our knowledge of ourselves and in all our knowledge of the world, we are always already encompassed by the language that is our own. We grow up and we become acquainted with man, and in the last analysis with ourselves when we learn to speak. In truth, we are always already at home in language. Gadamer argues specifically that language is the always already and has no origin, because there's no person or world before language. Now, again, this is not the mood, tone, or doctrine of any analytic philosopher, but it might motivate a similarly intense and detailed look at how language functions. Indeed, in many ways, the deconstruction of language in Derrida and his ilk, Agamben, maybe people like this, closely follows Heidegger and Gadamer, while also slyly blowing up their pretensions. Yes, Derrida says, we are linguistic creatures all the way down. Our language is in some sense gives us or is our reality. Language is our mode of access to the universe and ourselves. Derrida, I think, more or less agrees. Or the way we construct or reveal them. Literary interpretation is a good analogy for human experience as a whole. Literary interpretation is a good analogy for human experience as a whole. That's what a lot of these English professors thought. For both are interpretive activities performed on signs. But terrifying problems arise, Derrida points out. If we thought of the experience of the world as analogous to the act of reading, as in hermeneutics, we'd have to acknowledge that the act of reading produces delusion as frequently as truth. We'd have to acknowledge that every text that we can understand is liable to be fraught with obscurities and contradictions. A lot of the literature of the 20th century played with ambiguity, surrealism, obscurity. If the world and we are texts, maybe we're more like modernist poetry than classical drama, more like a novel by James Joyce than one by Jane Austen. Maybe we're trapped inside in a situation that we can't get far enough outside even to see, because we're trapped in this language, which meanwhile is collapsing. That's Derrida's edition. The postmodern moment, especially the French versions of figures such as Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, began to focus on the ways that the linguistic construction of reality, a structure without foundations, is always already collapsing. Jean Lyotard argued that all legitimizing master narratives had already broken down, except for maybe the one about how everything is language, and that the era couldn't make a coherent language for itself. Jean Baudrillard argued that the appearance-reality distinction had only a fictional or ideological resonance by 1980, and that we lived in a world of signs that signified nothing, a Disney world that encompassed all reality. Toward century's close, others explored more positive postmodern modes. Maybe that's the way the paragraph break should be. Toward century's close, others explored more positive postmodern modes. One of these was to focus on the concept of narrative or story by a number of figures, such as Paul Ricoeur and Alasdair MacIntyre, and many, many others. Narrative theory in psychology, history, and ethics, among other applications, centralized one particular linguistic mode, storytelling, as central to the construction of personality, culture, and reality, and as central as well to value theory. Life itself is a cloth woven of stories told, wrote Ricoeur in the third volume of his magisterial Time and Narrative, which was published in '84, the third volume, at least in the English translation. Wait, was it written in English? This theory of the human was very popular. Even Nike got on board in the 90s with their slogan, "We are the stories we tell." And if you heard someone say that, maybe it's Oprah, maybe it's Hillary Clinton, I don't know. Would it strike you funny? Because every time I hear it, from the first time I heard it, it struck me real funny. Like, all right, maybe you are a fucking story. I don't know. I feel like I'm a body or whatever, You might be reading. I'm digging holes, I'm fucking, or whatever I'm doing, but I'm not just reading. And these professors that think everything is reading, man, I sort of began to think it was pretty comical. And a grotesque mistake, like an unmakeable mistake, like there's nothing but words. But there it is, over and over again. I can't restrain my hostility. I'm just trying to set out the history, but I keep bopping back to the polemic. Here's Ricoeur. Temporality requires the mediation of the indirect discourse of narration. There can be no thought about time without narrated time. There can be no thought about time without narrated time. Which is not exactly to say there can be no time without narrated time. I think he thinks that too, but I don't know. Ricoeur asserted, and he used the concept to explain personal identity to, or whatever needed explaining. Seems like a pretty primitive, rudimentary view. Anything I want to explain, I just say, this is all there is in Ricoeur, if you ask me. Anything I want to explain, from ethics to personal identity to cosmology, I just go narrative. It can't happen without narrative. And I'll leave it at that. Why? Prove it. Right? Or I just say bullshit. Okay? It really is magisterial, though, I guess. I remember I sent University of Chicago Press my anti-narrative book, End of Story. And the editor who had edited my previous book for Chicago said, "Do you think Ricoeur would really be worried about this?" And I guess my answer was no. But he sure should be. And what I didn't say was like, you wouldn't believe how bad that shit sucks, man. Like, oh, come on. Okay. There can be no thought about time without narrated time, Ricoeur asserted. And he used the concept to explain personal identity, too. What justifies our taking the subject of an action so designated by his or her or its proper name? What justifies in taking the subject of an action as the same throughout a life that stretches from birth to death? The answer has to be narrative, he wrote. And that's the whole argument, actually. It has to be. What else could it be? Oh, I don't know. You want 20 more candidates? Because I'm here to give them to you. Narrative, for many late 20th century figures, provided a ground for psychology, ethics, and metaphysics. I say this was half-assed and ridiculous, man. It explains simultaneously the nature of human identity and the nature of the world we inhabit together, rather as God or nature, I think I already said this about language, but here about narrative specifically, had done for previous thinkers. Just as often as a priest says God, a professor says narrative. That was definitely true in the 90s, and in for just the same functions. And but with much more emptiness and much less plausibility. This sort of narrative theory was one version of what, by late in the century, in the work of influential philosophers such as Rorty and Taylor, came to be known as linguistic or social constructionism, the picture of a world made in significant measure by words. It had, or in words, or of words. It had hopeful or benevolent political implications, and this maybe was the fundamental motivation in a certain way. A world that has been constructed by us can be reconstructed by us, really just by giving new descriptions, rather than by overthrowing the system, say. We can make a better social world by focusing on revealing, critiquing, and reforming our languages. To study persons is to study beings who only exist in or are partly constituted by a certain language, wrote Taylor in his fundamental book, The Sources of the Self, 89. There is no way we could be inducted into personhood except by being initiated into language. In Rorty and Taylor, Bernstein and MacIntyre, the commonalities between analytic and continental philosophy and the ocean-straddling postmodern mood came to be self-conscious, to put it mildly. In them, at any rate, if not at meetings of the American Philosophical Association, analytic and continental philosophy converged. Both sides could argue about Noam Chomsky, for example, or developments in speech act theory. Even if few worked directly across the border, the continental analytic border, the wall began to seem more like a fence. You could see through it here and there and imagine climbing over. But by the same token, the questions they raised and the conflicts they prosecuted began to seem less urgent. A turn away from the linguistic turn began, and the next essay will be about the next turn, as I see it. Perhaps the questions that appeared urgent early in the 20th century had, by its end, to whatever extent they could be, or ever would be, been answered or abandoned. I'm not sure how much deeper or more sophisticated the philosophical treatment of language can go than it had gone by the 1970s on both sides of the water. Perhaps linguistic philosophy and narrative theory had become as overly refined by 1999 as German idealism had become by 1899, and its relevance as questionable. In the new millennium, to take one example of the transformed terrain, environmental issues came to be central in a way that seemed to render linguistic constructionism irrelevant, or seemed simply to suggest its falsity. And maybe it's evil a little bit too. Though discourse has many roles in helping create carbon emissions, for example, it's the material interactions of particles, which are, I'm saying, not narratives. I probably did a lot of sighing and eye rolling with Rorty and MacIntyre and people like that, and I don't think they really appreciate it. But I couldn't help it, man. Like, you believe that? No, you don't. You just don't. And so how about you do a philosophy where you say what you do believe? I can see how they got a little irritated with me. But in like climate change era, any philosophy that seems to undermine the reality of the natural world or make it a malleable human artifact has come to feel potentially destructive. Indeed, scholars' obsession with linguistic interpretation, their notion that everyone has always experienced the world as though they were reading a book, came to seem at a certain point to be an artifact of privilege as well as fundamentally implausible. And we are no longer a planet awash in newsprint, but a world of imagery and image-text hybrids of sorts not covered in the Tractatus. We seem to be more concerned right now about whether we're living in a virtual reality than whether we're living in a text. That all sorts of new questions have arisen, however, demands new reflection. I'll be talking about this in the next installment, but also makes possible new histories. That is, to tell the history of 20th century philosophy is now possible. As Hegel observed, you can't really tell the story of something until it starts winding down. All right, and so like I say, the next one's sort of about developments in philosophy post-2010, where I think a lot of philosophy has become confessional and self-help oriented. I call it the New Hellenism. John Cagg, for example, Agnes Callard. That would be next. Thanks. Here we are by the little branch of the Lattimore Creek in my backyard. Peace, yo.